Hello, welcome to the Gender and Digital Health webinar series. We have the fourth session of our series today with the title, What Causes the Digital Gender Gap? We have a stellar lineup of panelists, discussants, and one moderator. For those of you who only joined today, the webinar series is a platform to foster new partnerships and co-create knowledge on the gender dimensions of digital technologies for health, with a focus on translation of evidence to policy and practice-based learning in low and middle income countries. The series are organized by a consortium between United Nations University, the International Institute for Global Health, with University of Cape Town and BBC Media Action. We have monthly webinars that normally occur in the last Thursday of each month, and we are going to have also 2 workshops during this year. And the recordings of the previous sessions can be accessed on the Gender and Health Hub that is hosted at UNU-IIGH. So you can visit the website genderhealthhub.org to access some resources of papers and recordings and some blog articles related to the series. And we are also, for the first time, streaming live on YouTube. So you can also, if you didn't have time to register or in the next webinars, you can go straight to the YouTube and watch live. So we are very welcome to tweet and to share any content of this webinar in the social media, but please use the following hashtags so you can understand the impact of the webinars in social media and the spread of the message. So please use hashtag GHHTalks or hashtag Gender Digital Health. And please introduce yourself and ask questions in the chat. So in the session outline, we will have this introduction that is just introduction to the series and introduction to the topic by our moderator, Sara Chamberlain. And then we'll have a group of panelists that they are going to discuss the topic of what causes the gender digital gap. For 40 minutes. We will have some reflections and questions by our discussant, Kerry Scott. And then you're very welcome to ask questions to the panelists, and we will have Amnesty Lefebvre moderating the Q&A session for 25 minutes. So first of all, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Sara Chamberlain. So Sara is the digital, where she is responsible for designing and scaling mobile services for low literate and low-income communities. She has been at the forefront of digital communications in the development sector for 23 years, including 14 years spent designing and scaling mobile services in Asia. Her digital solutions have benefited millions of people and won many awards, including 3 GSMA Global Mobile Awards, a Microsoft Education Award, a Golden Bronze Lions at the Cannes International Advertising Awards, and 2 BAFTA nominations. Sara has designed and delivered digital capacity building programs So please, Sara, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Claire. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening, this afternoon, and this morning, depending on your time zone. So to start, I just wanted to quickly say a little bit about BBC Media Action, the organization I work for. So BBC Media Action is the BBC's international charity. We believe in media and communications for good. We reach more than 100 million people each year in some of the world's poorest and most fragile countries. Our projects and programs save lives, protect livelihoods, counter misinformation, challenge prejudice, and build democracy. And as Claudia mentioned, I work with BBC Media Action in India, and I'm joining you tonight from lockdown in a small rural farming community in Goa. So if my internet connection should drop, which it sometimes does, my colleague Amnesty Lefebvre will pick up from where my internet connection leaves off. So Amnesty will also be timekeeping the session. So I've spent the last 14 years designing and scaling digital development interventions in South Asia. And one of the most consistent challenges that we've faced to achieving broad, sustainable impact at scale is low levels of digital access and use among women. We'll hear from some of our speakers today that cost is one of the biggest barriers to digital adoption among women in Africa and Asia, i.e., phones are too expensive for women to buy. But in countries like India, where 93% of households own phones, but only an estimated 52% of women report having access to phones, I have to ask, too expensive for whom? Clearly, phones aren't too expensive for men in this country. A common assumption in the development sector is that the access challenge can be overcome by just giving women devices and SIM cards. But we'll hear from one of our speakers today. There's compelling evidence that when programs procure and distribute devices and SIM cards to women, they rapidly find their way into the hands of male family members who either confiscate them or monopolize them. So, if women's low levels of access to digital technology isn't just about cost or availability, what's going on here? We'll hear from our speakers today that a lack of education is preventing women from not just using smartphones, but even basic text messaging. In fact, a recent study by Johns Hopkins and the University of Cape Town in the state of Madhya Pradesh found that only 26% of pregnant women could open and read an SMS. It stands to reason that despite advances in voice technology, women's use of smartphones and the internet will be lower in countries with high levels of female illiteracy. But one has to ask, why are so many women than men illiterate in India? We'll hear from our speakers today about how men in Africa and Asia worry that their women will get up to no good if they get their hands on technology. The internet is so dangerous, they say. They'll get harassed, hacked, seduced, manipulated. And yes, this is true. But why are these risks considered manageable by men and boys, but not women and girls? Folks, the elephant in the room is sexism. We need to stop beating around the bush and face up to the fact that gender norms at home and in the community are one of the key drivers of the digital gender gap. Over and over, we hear from our research respondents that the value proposition for women's ownership of use of phones hasn't been established. Both men and women tell us that women don't really need phones. After all, what will they do with them? Waste time when they should be cooking, cleaning, and caring for the family? And if they do get their hands on those delicate, expensive smartphones, they're just likely to break them, right? And we'll hear from our speakers today. There's an intersection going on here between economics, critically, women's low levels of paid employment, and hence lack of financial independence, and gender norms, where poor families don't see the value in buying phones for women unless they can use them to earn money. The digital gender gap exists not just in rural communities in Africa and Asia, but in schools, universities, offices, boardrooms, and Zoom conversations around the world, including in the global tech industry, where there are so many less women in leadership positions than men. I'm now going to hand over to some of the women who've managed to beat these odds. They're going to shine a light on the barriers women face in accessing and using digital technologies, as well as jobs in the tech industry. I'm then going to hand over to a man who's trying to close the gap on one of the world's largest social media platforms. Next slide, please. We're going to start the conversation with Claire Sibthorpe. Oop. Yes, there we go. Claire is the head of Connected Women, Connected Society, and Assistive Tech at the GSMA. Claire has been working for over 20 years with public, private, and international development organizations on social policy and service delivery with a focus on ICT policy and practice. She has developed, managed, and implemented programs in Africa, Asia, and the UK, including as a senior consultant at Atos KPMG Consulting and at IDRC. Claire holds an MSc in Social Research Methods and an MSc in Social Policy and Planning in Developing Countries from the London School of Economics. Claire, welcome to today's session.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Could you start, Claire, by telling us a little bit about the scale of the digital gender gap in different countries around the world, as well as any differences that the GSMA has observed between Africa and Asia in terms of what causes the gap?
Sure. And maybe we can go to the next slide, which I think has some numbers that might be of interest. So I'm going to talk about mobile because that's really the technology that's reached women at an incredible scale. So 82% of women across low and middle income countries now own a phone, and mobile is the primary way most people are accessing the internet. So with over half of women in low and middle income countries having a phone. On the diagram here, you can see the gender gap for each region, with the gray circle showing the gender gap in 2017 and the purple circle showing it in 2019. I'm also giving a preview of some numbers that we're going to be announcing. Our annual mobile gender gap report, this year's one will be coming out in June, which has data we collected, face-to-face survey data we collected during the pandemic last year. So I have a little sneak previews, but the full report will come out in June. And you can see that, and this was looking at mobile internet. We also have the numbers for mobile ownership, but this slide is looking at internet. You can see it's been declining from about 27%, so women are 27% less likely than men to use mobile internet, to 15% in 2020. And you can see that the regions with the biggest gaps are South Asia and Africa. Now, this reduction in the gap has really been driven by South Asia, where it's really decreased significantly. So the gender gap was 50% in 2017, and the numbers we're going to be presenting in June show that it's down to now. It's gone from 27. It's gone from 50% in 2019, and it's gone down to 36% in 2020. That's in South Asia. Whereas in the other regions, including Africa, we haven't seen much change. It's been relatively stagnant. And a lot of reasons for this. So I think changing market dynamics and price erosion have likely contributed to this reduction in the gender gap in mobile internet in South Asia. So data has become more affordable in many countries, and there's evidence that smart feature phones are playing an important role. Things like the Geo phone, which is available for under $10, and its high uptake is sort of providing an affordable entry point for first-time users. So that's the sort of looking at the scale. As you can see, there are significant differences in the regions. And then maybe we can go on to the kind of next slide, because I think one thing is talking about the size of it, but then as you said, Sarah, what are the reasons? So why are there different gender gaps? What are the barriers that people are facing? And to do this, it's for us, while it's not a linear journey, this is the high-level framework that we use to look at the journey people take and the barriers they face over time. One thing that we observe is that in this journey, at each stage of the journey, the gender gap typically widens. So it's sort of smallest at ownership and gets wider at each stage. And on the slide, I've shown the top barriers in the countries we surveyed, with the arrows indicating if the barriers gone increased or decreased in importance since the previous year. So you can see that affordability, particularly handset affordability, is a primary barrier to mobile phone ownership, followed by literacy and skills. except actually in South Asia, where literacy and skills is the biggest barrier, and handset is affordability second, which I think is showing, again, highlighting that difference in terms of the market dynamics and improvement of affordability as a barrier in South Asia. Among mobile users who are aware of the internet, it's lack of literacy and skills that are the main barrier, followed by affordability. And we can see important changes. So for example, awareness of the mobile internet is growing quickly, with both men and women seeing it as being relevant to their lives. And safety and security has emerged as a barrier in more recent years. This includes things like harassment on social media, data privacy. But while these barriers are experienced by both men and women, as you can see, they're both there, women tend to experience them more acutely due to social norms and structural inequalities, in particular the disparities between men and women in terms of income and education. And recently we did some analysis that looked over the years of data we have to see if just being a woman reduces your chances of using mobile. And in many parts of the world it does. Even if women in low and middle income countries had the same levels of education, income, literacy, and employment as men, there would still be a gender gap, indicating that measures such as discrimination and social norms are at play. And we did some qualitative research in South Asia and in 2 countries in Africa, Tanzania and Cote d'Ivoire. And it was interesting also looking at the differences. So in South Asia, from that research, we saw that women face more challenges to adopting mobile internet than men, mainly due to social norms, where women were denied by male gatekeepers. So male gatekeepers played an important role. And they were, also other things such as they may felt it was less relevant or attainable. They're seen as being vulnerable to threats, potentially posing a risk to families' reputation, having also lack of purchasing power, leading busy lives, so not having the free time to learn the technology, having smaller social circles, and less confidence. But in Tanzania and Cote d'Ivoire, it was different. We didn't, the male gatekeeping of women's mobile internet adoption use was not common in those 2 markets, but still there were issues around sort of gendered roles and structural inequality. So having less access to paid employment or their own disposable income, so having to rely on men and others for purchasing of decisions, being less literate, having lower skills and confidence, having more safety concerns around harassment. So those were still at play in those 2 countries, but there was that difference in terms of the 2 regions, in terms of the role of the male gatekeeper being a much stronger role in the South Asian countries that we looked at. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the things that we're finding, but I think these are key barriers, but really strongly, as you mentioned in your comments, that's social norms and those disparities between men and women are really playing a critical role.
Sara, just before you respond, just to tell you you're at 7 minutes. Over to you.
Sorry.
Okay, all right. Thanks for that, Claire. I was particularly struck by, your finding that if women have the same education level and the same income level, despite that, there's the gap still exists, and how that highlights normative barriers. Could you now, Claire, say a little bit about your insights into triggers of women's adoption of the mobile internet, and how those triggers might differ between Africa and Asia?
Sure. So in both regions, we're seeing that use by others in their social circles, people's use by the internet and mobile by other people is a really important trigger, and that's a factor. But also in South Asia, we've seen more strongly that to be able to justify the use of mobile internet, it has to have both a strong personal appeal, but also externally justifiable rational benefits. So it has to help with making money, helping learning a productive skill, helping with children's education. So it has to be really justifiable, and that came out much more strongly in South Asia. And some of the sort of use cases that we're seeing as being prioritized are things like social connections, work and income, education, and for women often education for their children as well. So I think that some of the sort of important triggers, social connections, really important, social networks where women often also have less, but also, especially in South Asia, some of those sort of has to be justifiable.
That's very interesting, the finding about social networks, particularly in the context of women's collectives and social movements that are led by women and consist of women. So that's a really interesting finding. Thank you for that. And could you say the data that you collect for these studies, like the Mobile Gender Gap Report, does the GSMA disaggregate any of this data by wealth, education, rural, urban? And if yes, do you have any findings that you can share around this disaggregation?
Yeah, and in fact, our report that's going to come out in June, where we actually have some spotlights where we've done exactly that disaggregation and show the data. But what we're seeing is that if you're a woman, I mean, if you're in rural areas, you're more likely to be less connected, if you're less educated, you're unemployed, or you're living with a disability, or if you're older. These are all kind of key dynamics that just make the gender gap worse. And I'd say we'll be publishing a bit more on that because we get asked that question a lot. So we're trying to put a bit more data about some of that disaggregation in the report that's coming out in June.
Fantastic. I think that's going to be really interesting to see, because I think one of the challenges is when the development community just has access to sort of like one big number of this many women own smartphones or this many women have access to the internet. And when that's not disaggregated, it can potentially lead to people making, investments that might not yield the results that they'd hoped for a particular segment of the population.
And it's critical to disaggregate. It's critical to disaggregate. I mean, absolutely, you need to understand women's needs, their barriers, and they differ depending on the segment you're in, and so it's really important.
And finally, could you give us a little teaser maybe of any of the findings in the upcoming Mobile Gender Gap Report? I mean, I know it's not going to be published till June, but we're like hanging on, waiting to hear.
Well, so as I shared, in the first slide, the positive news is that the gender gap continues to decrease despite the pandemic. You saw the numbers I shared, but we are also seeing some points of concern. Picture's not entirely always rosy. So we'll be sharing a bit more about that as well. But I mean, I guess right as it stands at the early stage of the pandemic, we're still seeing that reduction, particularly in South Asia, driven by South Asia. But there are definitely points of concern which we'll be highlighting. I think if I say more than that, my team might have words with me.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Claire, for sharing your insights. In the slides you presented about the journey you think women make to become phone owners and then finally regular mobile internet users, you highlighted the key barriers of affordability, literacy and skill, safety and security, and relevance. And family disapproval is mentioned, but only as a barrier to phone ownership in that slide that you presented. And the link between relevant use cases and gender norms isn't expanded on so much, although you did just mention it in your talk just now. So I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Giorgia Barboni, whose research explores the role of gender norms in constraining women's access to and use of technology in rural India. So Giorgia is an assistant professor of finance at the University of Warwick's Warwick Business School and a research associate at CAGE. She was a postdoctoral research scholar at the Department of Economics and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. And her research interests are in development economics, financial intermediation, household finance, behavioral economics, and experimental economics. Giorgia is going to present some of the results of research she conducted with collaborators from Evidence for Policy Design, India, in the state of Chhattisgarh. Over to you, Giorgia.
Thank you so much, Sara. And thanks so much for inviting me to this very interesting panel and webinar. I must say that as a researcher, we are typically more intrigued by questions than answers. And joining a panel whose title is What Causes the Digital Gender Gap is already by definition a very great opportunity for me to learn and also to share feedback on my work. So Claudia, could you please move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So in the interest of time, let me go straight to the core of my talk. So what I would like to provide some material today for discussion is about the results from a large scale research initiative that we have started, that I have been lucky enough to start with a number of colleagues, Charity Moore, Rohini Pandey, Erika Field, Simone Schenner, and Natalia Rigaud. So we started this research initiative with two main objectives. The first one was to identify barriers that actually prevent women from fully engaging with phones. And then the second step was to actually identify, test, and evaluate potential solutions to lift these barriers. So in the slide that you can see, the title is A Tough Call. A Tough Call is the title also of a report that came out and that essentially summarizes the results from an extensive scoping work that we carried out in the first phase of this research initiative. What we had done in this scoping work was very much to use qualitative and quantitative data. And I see some of the results really speaking to what Claire has just mentioned, to try to identify what the barriers for women to use phones are. Something that I want to mention first of all is that we have looked at different dimensions, a socio-demographic dimension, including age, education, marital status, urban versus rural, and holding all these factors constant. When we, for instance, move from the bottom to the top decile, both in terms of empowerment and income, we still see that gender gaps, digital gender gaps are there. So both in ownership and usage. Now, what the type of barriers that we have seen are most binding are economic and normative barriers. In the report, we have an extensive discussion about what we believe are the most binding norms in India that prevent women from reaping the full potential of smartphones. We follow the Paluk framework of norms. We have identified norms around women being caregivers as very important, but also pre-marital norms in terms of purity as norms that constrain women from using phones. Now, one thing that I want to mention here, and that is kind of pivotal for the rest of the slides, is that what we have also identified during our scoping work, and this again speaks to what Claire just mentioned, is the very much important of gendered use cases, of use cases that could essentially lift these barriers and create an opportunity for women to meaningfully use phones. And this allows me, next slide, please. We can just move to, yes, the one, perfect. So this allows me to kind of introduce one program that represents for us a great opportunity to study how smartphone ownership, how phone ownership can translate into usage, and what type of barriers we do see in these kind of movement from ownership into usage as well. So this is the Skype program. The Skype program was implemented by the government of the Indian state of Chhattisgarh in 2018, and it consisted essentially in providing free smartphones to female household heads. So just to think about that, between August and September 2018, more than 2 million phones were distributed physically in the hands of women. There were a lot of advertising and like billboards in the streets. And the phones came also with 1 gigabyte of free data for 6 months. Now, what we have done was to leverage this Skype program and try to estimate the short-term impact of a program that gives the opportunity to women to own phone. And next slide, please. So how did we do that? How did we estimate the short-term impact of the Skype program? Well, we surveyed 3,392 individuals. 1,696 were women Sky beneficiaries and their husbands across 212 villages of the Chhattisgarh district of Raipur in 4 blocks. The surveys that we've carried out had a lot of components, but mainly they were targeting at measuring women's phone use and the type of normative context in which women live. And these were precisely used to estimate the short-run impact on Sky. Now, from a methodological perspective, in order to be able to measure the impact, we used sorry, let me move to the next slide so it's kind of clear about that. So in order to estimate impact, we essentially randomly selected some of these 210 villages to be surveyed before the distributions, and others were surveyed after. So the assumption here is that aside from time, the only thing different between pre and post distribution villages is the Sky program itself. And this allows us in a very close window, actually, because this baseline survey was carried out across a time span of 6 weeks. This allows us to study outcomes such as phone ownership and norms around women's engagement with phones. Now, let me move on to the next slide, because I want to provide some results about that, and then also speak about what's the next step in our research initiative. So by comparing villages pre and post the distribution of the Sky phones, first of all, we see that smartphone ownership increased a lot. I mean, these phones were precisely given in the hands of women almost. We have anecdotal evidence about how the distribution took place, and we see a 56 percentage points increase in smartphone ownership among women. Did usage increase by as much? Not really. We see that women's basic and advanced phone use increased by just 3 and 4 percentage points, respectively. And we see on the other hand that men's phone use increased by double women. So essentially we see a gap there. And another aspect that is really important here is that the Sky program gives us the unique opportunity also to study how beliefs around the women having phones changed. And what we see is that essentially views on appropriate use of phones by women somehow relaxed, but only when women were using phone in what we call a supervised setting. So if someone from the household actually oversees them, supervises them. So what are the main learnings? So what are the main lessons here? So what we can see from these short-term impacts of Sky is that it seems like that providing women with a handset, with a technology, with an asset, but we cannot, I mean, increases phone ownership, but that does not necessarily translate into usage. If there is no compelling case for women to actually use the phone. And this speaks exactly to what Claire mentioned before about, for instance, creating a justifiable reason for women to have phones. And this allows me to introduce my last slide, where we can just scroll down everything so that we can see all. Perfect. Thank you. So essentially what we are doing now, and this is the second phase of our research initiative, is that we want to leverage a set of interventions to improve women's engagement with Sky phones. So we have identified a number of barriers that include, of course, digital illiteracy, the fact that, of course, if you have an asset technology such as a phone, you need to experiment to be comfortable to use that. You need also to have a reason also in front of your household, your community, to be able to use the phone, for phones to be socially acceptable by the household, by the community. And for that, we have designed an IVR intervention that I'm happy to discuss more during Q&As or discussion. And the idea there is to connect women with important information from the government of Chhattisgarh. And we also recognize the importance also of being and receiving incentives in order to increase the returns to using phones, and as well as the importance of social connections. So we are in the process of carrying out a randomized control trial to precisely test these interventions, and we hope also to be able to provide results on these soon.
Thank you so much, Giorgia. And, similar to the GSMA, to Claire, you've identified resources, knowledge, and gendered, a lack of gendered use cases as key barriers to women's digital adoption in rural India. But you've also really highlighted the role of social norms. And the findings of the Skype Program study in Chhattisgarh, I think, are particularly interesting in this regard, as they highlight how simply giving a woman a phone doesn't translate into her using it. And I'm particularly curious, and maybe we could cover this in the discussion, about how ownership was defined and what ownership may have meant to women. Because to think that a woman says, I own the phone, but then she's not actually using it. So what does ownership mean if you don't use the thing you own, right? So that's the big question in my head. But it's really critical, I think, for governments, donors, and implementers to take into account the findings of that Skype Program study when considering procuring and distributing devices to low-income women at scale. And thank you so much for sharing this final slide on your work to test whether access to gendered use cases can support women in overcoming some of the barriers to digital adoption. And this is actually a great teaser for our next webinar at the end of May, which is focused on digital literacy. So thank you, Giorgia. And we'll pick up in the discussion afterwards some of the questions around your slides. So if we could now move on to the next slides, please. I'd now like to introduce Siddharth Swaroop. Sid is the India lead social impact, education, and communities at Facebook. He's a communication specialist, an entrepreneur, writer, and a serial innovator. He has an MBA by education, has worked in 17 countries and 5 continents, and most recently, prior to Facebook, he worked at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in India, and prior to that at BBC Media Action with me. So Sid, it's wonderful to have you here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that Facebook is in the middle of coordinating its response to the COVID crisis in India, in Delhi, where you're joining us from. So we really appreciate you being here. And so what I wanted to ask you is that BBC Media Action conducted a landscaping study recently in India, and we found a really pretty significant gender gap among users of social media platforms. And, a gap as much as I think with Twitter, for example, it's only 14% of Twitter's users in India are women. Now, with Facebook, our research revealed that in January 2020, 22.8% of Facebook's users were women. So, it's still a pretty big gap there. So could you tell us about the scale of the gender gap on Facebook in India today, so more than a year on since we did that study, and whether you see any differences in women's behavior on Facebook as compared to men? Over to you, Sid.
Sure. First of all, thanks, Sara, and everybody for inviting me for this. And yeah, while we are in the middle of kind of mounting a massive response to the COVID crisis, I did think this is an important enough subject, and I and Sara have been talking about it for a long time. So Sara, I mean, officially we don't release gender gap data. I think we should ideally, but we just don't. But what I can talk about is the fact that there is a significant gap, and that gap is very reflective of the overall gender gap that you see in the country for internet. right? So we know that there's almost a 50% gender gap for internet. In some cases, maybe more, like rural would be much more. And that is pretty well reflected in the gender gap that you see on our platforms. There is, of course, difference by platform. So if you look at WhatsApp, probably the gender gap is much, much lower, of course, amongst internet users. The gap is also lower on Instagram, given that it's younger urban audiences using it. Although it's now gone a lot to tier 2, tier 3, but again, I think there's a much lower gap there. I think Facebook is probably a higher gender gap and most reflective of the gender gap that you see overall across all platforms. And I think there are causes for it, which we can get into, but I think the most important thing to understand is the perception of legitimacy of use cases, right? So when you look at WhatsApp, right, when the moment you have, let's say, a nurses WhatsApp group, even in rural areas, they all see it as legit use case and are using it, right? But if you think of like just purely from an entertainment perspective, it's not seen as a legit use case. So in those cases, wherever a platform has that perception, you'll see a higher gender gap. So I think in terms of how women are using it differently from men, I think in terms of most of the use cases, it's similar. And that's one of the reasons why there's more. And for most use cases, it's entertainment, right? Entertainment or connecting with people. So if men feel that women are going to meet up with men, unknown men and so on and so forth, they're going to be restricted from using it. So there's a lot of gatekeeping that happens because of that. But what we've also seen is that one of the ways in which women use is to create their own tribes, whether it's on Facebook groups, whether it's on WhatsApp groups. And when they do create their own tribes, they actually report Facebook as being one of the safest spaces in the world, not just physical or virtual, just any space in the world that's safe for them. And the reason is that these closed groups provide a safe haven for women to discuss pretty much anything, right? There are groups that discuss masturbation. There are groups that discuss breastfeeding. There are groups that discuss saris, right? And you can't do that. You can't do a lot of those discussions, even in places like self-help groups, right? So in that sense, I think when women are able to find their tribe, they really find it useful.
Thank you so much, Sid. And what you've just said corroborates our finding as well, is that women's behavior or engagement with social media platforms and chat apps is quite different from men's in India. And one of the primary findings is that they prefer closed groups. So it's not surprising that the gender gap is much smaller on WhatsApp than it is in Facebook. And they also prefer closed groups and groups that are smaller than large public open groups that men prefer. So could you say a little bit more, Sid, about what you think is causing this gender gap? Because you mentioned the scale of the gender gap on the Facebook platform reflects the scale of the gender gap in India in terms of just mobile internet access. So could you say a little bit about what you think is causing it, both in terms of actual risks and perceived risks? Sure.
So I think I would say it's not just risk as the only factor, but I would look at it almost like a pyramid, right? Like a pyramid. So if you look at the base of the pyramid, which is the largest cause and largest reason, it's the gender norms. We all know that, right? So gender norms lead to inequality in pretty much access to any resource. Internet and mobile phones are just one of those, right? It goes all the way from basic nourishment to healthcare to everything else. So I think that's the base, right? Now, linked to that is this whole idea that internet gives you access to things that you shouldn't have access to as a woman, right? Whether it's access to unknown people, whether it's access to information that you should not have, and so on and so forth. So all those gender norms actually get kind of accentuated on the internet because of the wide access that is available to anybody who gets on the internet, right? And that then leads to gatekeeping by men And that gatekeeping leads to women, the idea that, internet is less safe for women than men. It's actually equally unsafe. There's no real difference in terms of safety. I mean, the number of frauds that that occur online, if you look at financial frauds, they are the largest number of frauds that happen online, and they happen with men, right? So it's not that maybe the nature of threat is different, but the threat is there for anybody who's joining the internet. So yes, there are some real threats, but at the same time, there's a lot of this perceived risks of women that are particularly attributable towards women being at risk, which is again part of our patriarchal mindset, right? So that's your base. At the second level of the pyramid is, the notion that women need digital literacy. They probably do to some degree, but then who doesn't? Anybody who gets on a phone the first time probably needs some digital literacy. But I personally is of the belief that if you give a phone into a woman's hand, she'll learn it just as easily as a toddler does, right? And I want to tell this story because it's so powerful that, when my son was about 2 years old and we had bought an iPad, he immediately instinctively took onto it. And then a friend of mine came in, and his son had a bit of learning disability. So when we said, hey, let them play on the iPad, my friend said, no, probably my son will feel intimidated because he has these learning disabilities. I said, just let them play with it. Okay. They're playing, they're not learning. And within 15 minutes, that child was doing everything that you can possibly do on iPad, right? He was drawing on it, he was learning on it, he was doing all kinds of things. And on that particular day, their perception about their child's learning ability changed because of his spending 15 minutes on the internet. So I just want to say that, if once women get a phone in their hand, I think they're just as smart as a toddler. I think that the main, at the top of the pyramid is the biggest problem, which is lack of legitimate use cases for women. Most of the internet is designed for the men because most of the users of internet are men. We've seen experiments after experiments where we've designed specialist use cases for women that is legitimate for them and for their families, and all the other barriers have broken down. They've pretty quickly learned how to use it. Their families have allowed them to use it. If they can make money, it's a legit use case. If they are part of a self-help group, for example, it's legitimate. If she's a nurse and there's a work group, it's legitimate. So I think the problem is this vicious cycle that because we continue to say, oh, women don't have access, therefore should we invest in use cases for women on the internet, because of which there are less use cases, which then further lead to more women not using the internet. So I think if we can solve for legit use cases, we'll also solve for a lot of the other barriers. Sorry for my very long answer, but
no, Sid, that was really interesting. And I've heard you say before, if a woman gets a phone in her hand, clearly she can do what a 2-year-old can do and immediately start using the internet. And, that's that on the surface can sound like quite a controversial statement. But I think the way that you prefaced it tonight by saying that the base, in terms of the barriers, if you look at the barriers like a pyramid, and the base of the pyramid is norms, that's what's preventing women at each stage in the journey in first getting their hands on phones, then being able to experiment with phones, then being able to freely use phones. I mean, as Giorgia shared earlier, even after the Chhattisgarh government distributed 2.1 million phones to women and they had free phones in their hands, well, that was the theory that they would have these phones in their hands. There was only, I think it was Giorgia, 3 to 4% increase in women's use of phones. And that use was under supervision by men. So clearly we really are talking about normative barriers, and it's great to hear somebody from Facebook talking about this. So what I'd now like to ask you is, what is Facebook in India doing to address this gap? And also, what approaches have you seen women Facebook users employ to manage the harassment, bullying, and gender-based violence that they face online?
Sure. So a couple of things I want to talk about. To start with, it makes 100% business sense for every tech company to have more women on their platform, right? So therefore, there is a inherent business interest in having more women. And I think every tech company, not just us, is working, putting significant resources behind women's safety, women's education, as well as use cases for women and everything else that we can do to ensure that women can be online. And I just want to refer to one data set, which I think was particularly important, which is a non-business data set, which is that there was a study that was done globally looking at almost user data of 1.2 billion Facebook users. This was published in the American Scientific Journal. And what it showed was that in geographies, and this was done across, I think, 112 or 114 different geographies around the world. And so it's a really large scale kind of data dive. And what they found out was that in, for example, 2015, if a particular country or geography had a higher internet or a lower gender gap on Facebook, the following year, the gender equality index went up in that country. But the reverse was not found to be true. So what that study concluded was that people on Facebook, and I would just kind of extend that to internet as a whole, women on the internet, more women on the internet actually increases gender equality, right? And that is one of the principles, one of the bases that we're using to build our gender equity program, to say that, more women on the internet is a good thing, right? So there are different ways in which we address this. We work with the policy, whether it's at the government level, whether it's our own internal policies of, how do we set community norms for our platform, what's allowable, what's not allowable, how we define harassment. There's a lot of user input, gender expert input, etc., that goes into defining our own internal policies. We work at the product level. So I think if you look at any of the platforms, and if you actually start looking at the features that allow women to control what they can and cannot do on the platform, you'll see that Facebook has by far the most, by far, it's not even comparable. On places like Twitter, etc., you just can't control who gets to see what. On Facebook, you can control if only your friends should see your post, everyone should see your post. You can even restrict which friends see your post. You can be part of closed communities. You can lock your profile to prevent identity theft. There's actually about 300, 400 different features that are linked to either your privacy or your online safety. We also have helplines. We have educational programs. We've trained hundreds of thousands of women on ground, in villages, in towns, on both digital literacy as well as online safety, and we are actually expanding expanding those programs exponentially in the coming years to make sure that more and more women. So, for example, one of our tie-ups is with Jivika and Bihar, where our intent is to get at least 10 to 12 million women online, and that will be accompanied with the starting point of that is digital education and basic safety training. And I think one of the biggest things that we are doing, in addition to product and policy and programs, is supporting entrepreneurship, right? I think Facebook has, I don't remember the exact number, but my guess is it's almost like 1 billion small businesses that are associated with Facebook globally. And a lot of them are women entrepreneurs. We have a bunch of programs to support women entrepreneurs everywhere, including in India. And this
Sarah,
goes all the way down to the—
Sorry to just interrupt. You're at 16 minutes, Sarah. So we need to—
Oh, sorry,
okay.
Sid.
Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. So thank you so much, Sid, for sharing those findings and also the efforts that Facebook is making to really put control into the hands of women users to be able to, protect themselves online and keep themselves safe online and manage their user experience. And I really appreciate you taking time out to join us tonight when I know that you're in the middle of your COVID response effort. So I'm gonna, can you stay a little bit longer, or are you gonna need to jump off and get back to your calls and coordinating?
Yeah, I can stay for a bit, yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so I would now like to move on to our next
Sorry,
speaker.
Sarah, just before you introduce Araba, just 2 comments. We just want to give a shout out to all of our colleagues on YouTube Live. Thank you for joining us. And for those of you that are here with us in Zoom, please do kind of use the Q&A feature to ask questions. So far we've sort of banked 2 or 3 questions. Please, build that out a little bit more so we can have a sort of fruitful conversation at the end. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Amnesty. And I think our next speaker is really going to add to this discussion, because one of the things that you mentioned, Sid, and Giorgia also alluded to this, and Claire, about the importance of relevant use cases or gendered use cases. And Sid, you mentioned about, the kind of use cases that you mentioned, nurses getting together, farmers getting together, tended to focus on money, on economic activity. And this intersection that Giorgia highlighted from her research, where, the women's very low levels of employment in India intersect with social norms to really prevent people from going online. And our next speaker is going to share some of her findings from Rwanda and Ghana that I think are going to show us that similar things are happening in Africa. So I'd now like to introduce Araba Say. So Araba is a principal researcher with Research ICT Africa and a senior research scientist at the University of Washington Information School. She's managed international research projects on the impact of computer and internet access in a variety of contexts, including studies of the social and economic impact of public access computing, technology entrepreneurship, and livelihood sustainability, coding bootcamp models, gender digital equality, gender and tech hubs in Africa, and participatory methodologies for gender data collection in Africa and Latin America. Araba is going to share findings from her research in Rwanda and Ghana, which I think both corroborates and extends the findings from the research that we've seen in India. So Araba, welcome to the session, and thank you so much for joining us so early from Seattle. Are you there, Araba?
Yes, thank you.
Hi. So my first question is, could you just tell us a little bit about the emerging findings from your research in Rwanda to understand what causes the internet gender gap there, which I understand is one of the widest in Africa?
Yes, indeed, Rwanda has a surprisingly wide gender internet gap, considering that it also has very progressive gender equality policies at the national level, as well as some of the best network coverage and the lowest internet data cost in Africa. So in this study by Research ICT Africa and the Center of Gender Studies at the University of Rwanda, we did some focus groups with urban and rural internet users and non-users, male and female. And our main finding was a strong link between low female labor force participation, access to disposable income, perceptions of women's need for the internet, and women's actual access to and use of the internet. The female unemployment in Rwanda is higher than for men, especially in rural areas. And as such, a lot of women don't earn an income and cannot afford internet access. But it was not just about not having income or internet access being too expensive. The real issue was having personal disposable income. So that's income that a woman would feel justified spending on herself. So some of the things we learned were that women depend on their husbands for finances, which they're expected to manage responsibly. So even when there's a leftover budget, which is always, anyway, the budget is always too little, given the choice of spending that extra on other household needs or on their personal internet use, women would tend to choose the former, which is not the same calculus that a man would make. These were some of the comments they were making to us. Another thing was that women's preoccupation with domestic chores was a major barrier, especially for married women. And this seemed to interact with the low formal employment levels to create a perception that women do not need the internet, whether because they should be focusing on their domestic duties or the internet is for working people, or access to other information tools such as radio and TV at home should be sufficient because they're at home all the time anyway. On the other hand, men would associate their own internet use with work to justify its importance for themselves, while downplaying women's use on the grounds that it's irrelevant for housewives. So that was a sort of a second observation we made. There are also pervasive perceptions that women lack the confidence, interest, and motivation to use the internet. Although several participants pushed back against this view. But the interesting thing was that while some participants implied that this lack of confidence or interest or motivation was a character flaw of women, others linked it to the psychological effects of unemployment and being cooped at home all the time. So there's this psychological dimension also that I don't think we've paid much attention to as researchers. And finally, we observed perceptions that the internet, especially social media, is harmful to spousal relationships. And these kind of concerns lead to restrictions on women's access, sometimes to domestic violence, and sometimes even a voluntary abstention by some women from using the internet or using social media for fear of disrupting their marriages. And so what this is telling us in total is that while gender policy regulation of the telecom industry can help to advance gender digital equality, attention to those structural, social, cultural barriers is also critical. And without that, the real change is unlikely to happen.
Thank you, Araba. Those findings are pretty profound. And it really raises the question in my head. I mean, as you said, what does this mean for women who aren't paid for work? Because everything I'm hearing tonight is that if you're paid for your work and you have some kind of independent income and some control over expenditure, then you can get your hands on technology and you're sort of allowed by society to do that. But if you're a housewife who does a huge amount of work but isn't paid for it, the use case just isn't respected. And one of the things you said that I thought was just, particularly sort of tragic is the way the women actually make the decision to spend their money, if any money that they have, on their household. Like they are willing to sacrifice their digital needs in favor of their family, while men in the family are not prepared to do that. So what I now like to ask you about is moving on to your research in Ghana. And I understand there that your research is exploring barriers that girls in elementary schools and high schools in Ghana face in accessing technology, and how it seems to be influencing their aspirations for tech jobs.
Yeah, so this study in Ghana was conducted in association with colleagues at MaTech Foundation, which is an NGO that provides training in technical and technical vocations to young women in rural and peri-urban areas. And we sought the views of elementary and high school girls on their access to and experience of using communication technologies at school and at home, as well as their aspirations towards ICT careers. And the results indicated a generally low enthusiasm for ICT careers, although that was not entirely attributable to gender. The things like limited ICT infrastructure in rural areas, inadequate ICT facilities and learning tools in schools, and the structure of ICT education in schools affects both boys and girls. However, these deficits also contribute to an environment in which competition for access to resources, that is, technological resources, seems to leave girls more disadvantaged than boys. For example, by being more aggressive, boys tend to edge girls out of access to the limited number of computers in school labs, making it difficult for girls to develop their digital skills. More generally, one of the things we found was that girls were quite enthusiastic about ICT studies, ICT education in their early years. But then this interest seems to dwindle as they grow older and are channeled in different directions by social norms. So the youngest participants in our studies reported fairly unrestrained access to ICTs, while the older girls were more likely to refer to barriers such as the burden of household chores, as well as being restricted from access due to their parents' concerns about the dangers of the internet to young women. So I will say that it wasn't all bad news. So and analysis sort of points to shifting and evolving attitudes and varied experiences depending on socio-economic status or kind of the family, specific family circumstances of individual girls. And so, for example, several girls' favorite subjects and career goals were in science fields such as mathematics and physics that are sort of at the foundation of technology professions and are often considered the domain of males. And even though ICT-related careers were, career aspirations were low, they were also not limited to the traditionally feminized occupations. So we still need to tease out how much of the low interest in ICT careers is a result of personal preferences, which is okay, and how much is a result of this apparent subtle realigning of girls' choices as they enter their reproductive years.
Thank you, Araba. And you know, the point that you made about, you know, boys literally in these, I can just see it in the classroom and in the one computer that's in the classroom, and I'm sure, you know, crowding around and monopolizing it and just not giving space to girls. And the thing I keep hearing, and I wonder almost if we in the development sector almost kind of reinforce this, is this thing about it's unsafe for women. Because you know what it reminds me of? It's a narrative that you hear around women's mobility in India. Like, it's not safe for young women to go out on the street unchaperoned. It's not safe for women to use public transport. It's not safe for women to go to the park. It's not safe. And you know the safety narrative, it's a bit insidious because it's presented as caring for women and girls. Like, we care about you, we want to keep you safe. But it's very infantilizing, and it seems that it's being used as a, you know, to stop learning, experimentation, and women going online. So my next question is really around now taking a global view. And this is what's so incredible about your research, is it's so diverse. But could you talk a little bit about some of the barriers you've identified around women's participation in the tech industry? And, you know, including barriers to women in tech leadership positions.
Absolutely. So we've done some reviewing of existing literature at the global level, and focusing right now, I'm going to focus more on the experience of women who have already overcome barriers at the access and skills development levels. And so once you've, you know, passed that barrier, there seem to be still at least 3 types of obstacles that cut across different contexts. And the first one is gender-based discrimination, which originates from conscious and unconscious biases about women's aptitude and ability in technical fields. And these biases can affect the entire career experience, from recruitment, where researchers have documented that job vacancy ads, for example, contain subtle cues about the gender of the ideal candidate, to salary levels where there continue to be unexplained gender pay gaps for technology workers, to performance evaluation, mentoring, career development, where the evidence suggests that when women do rise in the ranks, they tend to be promoted into less influential management roles that do not lead to executive positions. So that kind of discrimination continues to be a barrier to advancement and to leadership in the technology industry. And the perception of that discrimination can discourage women from choosing that as a career path as well. Secondly, technology industry workplaces have developed a reputation for environments that are unwelcoming and sometimes even hostile towards women. And this manifests as either overt or covert forms of harassment that compromises women's sense of safety, as well as their comfort in the workplace. And so that leads to high turnover rates. There's evidence that women leave technology jobs at a faster rate than men do. Or if they stay, there's a very high psychological cost, which again, I think is one of the things that we don't pay sufficient attention to, because we think once the women are there, that means the battle has been won. But the women who are there are really paying a high price for being those role models, or for having that success, as it were. And finally, the broader social, cultural, and institutional context that we've been talking about for the last hour or so can affect a woman's ability to be successful as a professional, or again, can exert a high personal cost. Amongst other things, women have to deal with the dual responsibilities of paid professional and unpaid domestic work due to norms about gender roles in the home. So while men are rewarded for work devotion, women are generally penalized socially for doing the same, for showing work devotion. On the other hand, if women prioritize, or women professionals prioritize family devotion, then they are penalized professionally for that. So it's sort of, it's a no-win situation for women, whereas for men, it's usually a win-win, because work devotion is good and family devotion is also sort of gives them credits in essence. So these sort of expectations about work-life balance can also discourage women from pursuing a career in the technology industry at all, or from pursuing advancement opportunities in the industry. So in combination, these three barriers either cause women to make other career choices, or even if they do go into the industry, they have to put up with some uncomfortable, unsafe conditions, and bear the psychological costs of that, which can also lead them to make decisions about how far they want to advance in the industry.
Sara, I hate to put a pause because I could just listen to Araba all day. Such amazing comments.
That was my last question.
Okay, great.
That was my last question, and thank you so much, Araba. And I can only think, if you were to do that research again, after a year of the COVID pandemic, how much that would have been accentuated, and how many women I know who are in that position where they're the carer. They're the person who has to prioritize their family, and what the kind of sacrifices that women are having to make right now in digital jobs. So I would now thank you very much. And before we open up the conversation to all those on Zoom and everyone out there on YouTube Live, I'd like to welcome our discussant, Kerry Scott, to reflect on the conversation so far. And Kerry Scott is a research associate at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and an independent consultant. She is a social scientist with 9 years experience in global health research. Her focus areas are human resources for health, social accountability, community participation in health, community health workers, gender, power, provider-patient relationships, and health system governance. She's passionate about building a world where everyone enjoys the right to health. Over to you, Kerry.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to all of the panelists. I know there's some questions building in the attendees, so I won't take too much time. I just wanted to sort of reflect that our team, and it includes Amnesty, who's here, and as our research manager, Osama Umar, who's also here as an attendee, we did a lot of work on gender and phone access and use in rural India as well. And it's striking to see the parallels with what has been found in other settings in India and other countries. And some of our work involved talking to women, mothers of young children who said they did have access to a phone, and then also talking to their husbands and kind of understanding, what does this really mean? And as the panelist has said, you know, access to a handset is just one piece of a puzzle. And we found that there were, you know, 5 real core determinants of use and barriers to use that the panelists have also identified. And one thing that we found very interesting is that when you talk to people about their ability to, talk to women about their ability to use a phone, they really say that they have total freedom to access the phone. They don't have to get permission to access the phone or anything like that. But in reality, this freedom is completely contained within these barriers of having limited time of the day where the phone is near them. If they do have a phone all the time, it's a worse phone that's not topped up with credit. They have such a narrow use case. Most women we spoke to, they just said, well, the phone is to call home, talk to my mom, and to make sure I can keep in touch with my husband when he's not here. There wasn't really a broader use case for them. And, you know, a range of other barriers that we've heard about. So one thing I was really hoping the panelists would return to is this idea of triggers to change, because we have been through the barriers quite a lot. And I think everyone has touched upon triggers. We've heard about, you know, lowering the cost of handsets and data, social networks that support using phones, creating use cases, this sort of controversy around digital literacy training and what does that really mean? What are the incentives to using phones? And I see that Carol Ndosi has asked the panelists to speak more about ways to promote meaningful and equal access to technology in light of these barriers. So before we move further along that discussion about what it will really take to close the gender gap, I wanted to just bring up a slightly sort of side angle on this and mention that when listening to the panelists, I was coming back to this quote by the American social reformer and abolitionist Frederick Douglass. And he's the person who is attributed with saying, you know, power is never ceded without demand from below. And when you think about this quote in light of what we're talking about today, there's kind of 2 angles that came to mind. We talk about triggers to mobile phone use, but maybe we should speak more about what it is about the phone use that is meaningful. To what extent would women's use of digital tools just re-entrench the same unequal gender roles? So it'd be great to have the panelists sort of think about the ways in which women's use of digital tools can actually help them demand change for these broader patriarchal structures, and how digital access is transformative rather than just another space to re-entrench patriarchy. And the second way that this quote kind of made me think about this panel differently is a bit more provocative, but I'll just throw it out there for your thoughts. And it's sort of, to what extent is the digital gender gap the battle that all women want to fight, or the right battle right now? What is the level of demand from below in different settings? We do know that there are costs to challenging any power structure, and there might be people and places that have more pressing priorities. So how do we handle this in our work? I'll hand it over to Sara again, but just wanted to add those 2 conversation points.
Actually, Kerry, I think it would be great if each of the panelists could respond to those challenging and provocative questions. So maybe you'd like to ask the panelists herself. I mean, I don't know if we want to go in order. Claire, do you have any thoughts on, can women, is there a demand to use digital to challenge patriarchy, and should we be using digitally transformative in this transformative way? And I mean, what's your response to Kerry's really interesting questions?
Thanks. You asked about the demand. I mean, I'm not going to necessarily respond to challenge patriarchy. That's not a particular area that we research. I wouldn't want to presume to answer. But in terms of the demand from below around digital, and the need for digital, and to use it in that way that kind of transforms lives, and we're seeing that very much so. I think especially in the context of COVID, and I think the numbers I showed earlier, despite COVID, despite women being disproportionately negatively impacted, we're still seeing a reduction in gender gap. And I think it's highlighted things like lockdown, where women have those expectations to be educating their children, all those sort of social norms in some ways are kind of highlighting just the importance of access, especially during lockdowns, and and causing a demand and a real argument from women to some of those male gatekeepers to try and to get that access. So that's not asking about the challenging patriarchy, which I don't feel qualified to answer, but I think the fact that also the fact that phones are so the cost is quite high if you're looking at a low income person. The fact that people are willing to pay those costs despite the the high costs, again, just I think highlights just how important people feel these are for their lives. These tools are for their lives. The percentage of income cost for people who are on some incomes that we're talking about, it's very high, but yet they're willing to make those payments, and yet we're still seeing some of these strong demands and need for these tools. So I think that highlights just really the importance that people have placed. And I think COVID, especially lockdowns, have really highlighted that and made it even more critical as a tool for access to not just services, but just to be able to talk to loved ones, to be able to educate them and all that sort of stuff as well. So not totally answering your question, but I'll maybe let others who maybe looked at that particular issue more.
Thank you, Claire. And what you have touched on there is demand. And I think that quote that Kerry gave, that power is never ceded without demand from below. And so Claire, you touched on demand that's being generated by specific needs. Giorgia, would you like to respond to Kerry's questions?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kerry. That was a lovely set of points that I think we all, that are really challenging. And I wanted to echo Claire in the sense that women benefit from phones on a number of dimensions. And I also wanted to touch upon what Sid has mentioned about entrepreneurship. Women do also, like if we think about women economic collectives, it's becoming more and more imperative for women to get access to market inputs, market linkages that nowadays are only possible probably through phones, through smartphones, potential also to platforms like aggregators that would put them in touch with suppliers and avoid competitions at a local labor market, And on separate field work that I'm doing, where I'm precisely looking at digital engagement for self-help groups, we do see an interest for women that kind of emerges, especially when women look at other women having phones, like members of SDGs that aspire and become SDG leaders or treasurers or secretaries who they themselves own the phone because they have their duty to stay in touch with the upper hierarchy of the women economic collectives structure. So I feel like there's I mean, at least for what I can see and tell, there's a demand, and importantly, what one can say is also that, and I also wanted to touch upon about those triggers that you mentioned, right? I mean, the fact that there's so much interconnections between bridging the digital gender gap and bridging so many other gaps that women face broadly on technology that might not be phones, but you know, I'm thinking also on cleaning stoves clean stoves that might be related to also the use of phones. If we think about like in a forward-looking perspective about the fact that there could be an access to a number of programs that leverage digital technologies to do good in the lives of women across so many different dimensions. I'm not sure again if I've answered this question. Maybe there are more thoughts than answers again. But
Sara, I wonder before we, I'm just looking at the time. Sorry, that's my attempted role to sort of rein us in a little bit. I know we just have 5 minutes remaining, and I wonder if we could just shift gears subtly a little bit and pose a question to Araba, and then maybe have others pick up, which is really more of going towards the solution side of things. And we did have one question from one of our in the Q&A about this, which was whether or not any of our panelists had experience on the use of mobile money services and the impact these might have on narrowing the digital gender gap in some regions. So Araba, I don't want to put you on the spot, but this question also came from Ghana. So I'm going to kick it to you and ask if you could reflect on this, and as well as any other solutions that have you know, come to you for addressing some of the multitude of concerns around access and use that you've mentioned. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's sort of, at this point, I'd say no easy answers. For the question on fintech, at least from what I have seen so far, there's quite a bit of research going on, but I think much of it is exploring or exposing the potential. It's still all about the potential, but to demonstrate the reality, and not just the reality in a few pockets of places, but the reality in a big push development kind of way. That is yet to be demonstrated. So there's a lot of potential for fintech to help to close the gender gap. But again, as with all other issues related to gender equality and gender digital equality that we've discussed today, that sociocultural layer is still going to lead to these kind of gaps existing, whether in a high income or low income country. We're finding that those gaps exist. So if you don't deal with that, you can throw all the fintech you like at the situation, and nothing is really going to change. You'll see a little change, but you won't see the kind of change that we're looking for, the kind of change that really makes a difference. So in terms of solutions, I always end up at that barrier, at the sociocultural layer. None of the issues we're discussing here are new. No, we've been talking about this for years. So it's not for want of trying. It's not for want of fighting. It's not for want of, the sort of referring to the quote Kerry made. It's not for want of people below demanding that change. And if after all these decades of knowing and demonstrating that gender equality is not only just the right thing to do, but it actually has economic benefits. And it seems that the economic benefits, the economic rationales are what these days seem to be more convincing, which I think is a pity, because I think it should be, if we were going on the ethical rationales, we would be seeing more change. So I think we have to start we need to retune our minds. And one of the ways to do that is, I know there's the push to empower women, but I think we should also be doing a lot more to empower men, to be comfortable with powerful women or with empowered women. So, you know, some of the new masculinities work that is happening to change the notion of what it means to be a man, I think is as important as trying to encourage women to see themselves as having agency. So beginning to work on that angle as well, since we've tried all the other stuff already, might, you know, help us to start making some inroads. And connected to that, you know, changing the notion of men to also give them the freedom to express their feminine side, you know, I think it would go a long way. It affects, you know, the home dynamics. It affects the work dynamics, because all of a sudden you have a different notion also of what an ideal worker is. And, you know, the value of paid and unpaid work, the value of unpaid domestic work, all those things start to be seen as contributing to human development in one way or other. And so I think starting to change those dynamics, and maybe starting as early as possible. So I think early education, that's where this needs to happen. I think some of us, our current generation, may be too late to have a real change.
There's still hope yet. There's still hope yet.
But, you know, let's try and start introducing these ideas from elementary school, you know, the associations between doctors and nurses, female and male, those sort of little cues that people start getting when they're growing up. Start to dismantle those so that we have a generation growing up that has been desocialized from these notions of gender. Maybe we'll start to see something happen.
I think you've said it all. So I think on that note, I'll just sort of close our panel today, Sara, if that's okay with you. And just a hearty thank you to all the speakers, and to Sara and to Kerry as our discussant. Just 2 slides, and then I promise we'll wrap for today. I know we're a minute over. But just to sort of mention that next month's session is going to focus on digital literacy. So we've heard a lot of sort of interesting teaser discussions today around measurement. We didn't really have a chance to get into this, but I hope you'll come back and join us, including our colleagues here that are our panelists today. Just to also mention, as we might have sort of indicated on prior sessions, we have a forthcoming supplement in BMJ Global Health. This is from our community of practice in India for digital health. And that's on digital innovations for community and primary health in India. And it includes over 40 publications across a variety of levels of the health system, from beneficiaries all the way up to system support. There's also a handful of papers on methods and measurement. So stay tuned for that. We'll have more on that as it gets released over the summer. And then just to notice that there's another publication that's come out from our group on avoiding the road to nowhere. It's in a special issue in global policy that also should be forthcoming. So we'll provide those links as they become available. Next slide, please. And just lastly, to give you a big picture overview of the webinars to come, this is also on the UNU website. So I'll ask one of my colleagues to just paste that website link in the chat. As I mentioned, the digital literacy one is happening in May. That's followed by sessions in June on innovations around evaluation. So there's a back-to-back session there, including a workshop that's going to focus on deep diving into process evaluations for digital health solutions with a gender lens. We'll be talking later in the year about ethical issues. There's a session on social media, phone surveys. So you can see from the forthcoming sessions to come, we have much to continue in terms of our conversation. So thank you again very much for coming today.